All right, Alexander, let's talk about what is happening in Ukraine. We have the row between Zelensky and Zelensky, and we have the situation on the front lines. But we also have the EU pledging more money, more ammunition, and the United States divided about Project Ukraine, with some Republican lawmakers insisting that not another dime goes to Project Ukraine until there is some transparency and some accountability. And of course, the priority right now with many lawmakers in the United States is the war in Israel. So let's let's start, I guess, with Zelensky and Zelensky, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about this because, of course, yesterday was a day of swirling reports and rumors about power struggles and generals being sacked and other generals being under investigation. So, there were reports, and they were reports from pretty, authoritative figures. Members of the Ukrainian parliament were coming forward and saying that three generals, including General Tarnavsky, who is the overall commander of Ukrainian forces in southern Ukraine, the general, in other words, who has been conducting the main part of the offensive. You remember the summer offensive? He was the general conducting the summer offensive against the Russians in Zaporozhye region, whose armies were supposed to break through to the Sea of Azov and to the Black Sea. So General Tarnavsky was supposedly was going to be sacked. Another general was going to be sacked who was in charge of control, watching, monitoring the border between Ukraine and Russia in the north. Very sensitive political role. And there were other reports also that General Zaluzhny was under investigation, that the chief medical officer of the Ukrainian military, who's a woman, by the way, and also has general rank, that she was going to be sacked as well. And Strana, which is one of the most reliable Ukrainian political military publications, reported this. And as I said, so did several parliamentarians. Then we got reports from the Ukrainian Defense Ministry saying this was not true, but they only said that after several hours had passed. And one gets the sort of sense overall that there is a mounting political crisis in Kiev. I'm guessing, this is a guess now, but the most plausible guess is that there was a plan to sack generals, presumably in order to weaken and isolate Zaluzhny, who it seems to me that his relationship with Zelensky has completely broken down, but that perhaps Zaluzhny or someone else in the military pushed back and said that they weren't going to accept these resignations, and Zelensky, perhaps in a weakened position, had to pull back and at least delay announcing them. And all of this is happening with the Russians stirring the pot. Nikolai Patrushev, Putin's national security advisor, the secretary of the Russian Security Council, he said that there are people in the wings in Kiev who are preparing, waiting to take over. And, well, as I said, some people think that the Russians might be playing a role in all of this. I don't myself. I think this is just Patrushev, as I said, stirring the pot and being mischievous. And at the same time, we're also getting reports that William Burns, the CIA director, is flying to Kiev tomorrow. And of course, there's, again, huge amounts of speculation. We don't know for a fact that he's going, by the way, but there's huge amounts of speculation that if he does indeed go, what is his role in all of this? One view is that he's going to play an active part in these intrigues, whose ultimate end point is Zelensky's own resignation. The idea being, you leverage Zelensky out, you put Zaluzhny in and make him president, and Zaluzhny then starts negotiations of some kind with the Russians. That's one view. The other view, which I more favour actually, is that Burns is going to Kiev to try to calm the situation, to try to stabilise it. Because we have a gathering catastrophe on the front lines. I mean, reports are now pouring in of Ukrainian troops in really severe difficulty. The Ukrainian Air Force has been, as far as I can tell, largely blown out of the skies. And I would have thought that any sensible, rational government in Washington would say to itself, this is not the moment to carry out those kind of, events, those kind of coups or uprisings in Kiev. You want stability there, because there's a real risk that instability in Kiev will further result in more instability and demoralization and potentially even collapse on the front lines. So I think that is where what the purpose of sending Burns there is, in order to put plaster on what I suspect is a festering sore now.
So what is the situation on the front lines?
Well, it's getting worse every day. And I have to say, things are moving in some ways, in Avdiivka at least, actually faster than I'd expected. I mean, Avdiivka is a town of about 30,000 people before the war. So it's not a small place. It's got big industrial facilities. It's been very, very heavily fortified. The Ukrainians have made it one of their major defense positions in the Ukraine, in their defense system. And it was also supposed to be the position from which, in the event that there had been a Ukrainian offensive to recapture Donetsk city, the offensive would have been launched from Avdiivka. So it's a key place. And I expected personally that this would take a very long time to play out. The Battle of Avdiivka would take a very long time to play out. What I get the impression is that, on the contrary, the Russians are making faster progress closing the ring around Avdiivka than I had expected. This is despite all the minefields, all the fortifications, all the brigades that Ukraine is pulling from every conceivable point in the front lines and rushing to Avdiivka to hold the positions there. The Ukrainians have been mounting counterattacks. They've been pulling every stop to try to slow or stop the Russian offensive around Avdiivka. And I get the sense that it's not working, and that the Russians are moving faster, perhaps even than they expected, that they're now busy capturing this village to the west of Avdiivka and the northwest of Avdiivka. They're, gradually tightening their pincers around Avdiivka. They've advanced into an industrial zone to the south of Avdiivka. I'm not going to give a time estimate for how quickly that battle will end, but it's progressing, I think, surprisingly fast. And the news everywhere else is equally bad. So in Bakhmut, Ukraine is also on the back foot now. The Russians are pushing hard around Bakhmut. Overnight, there was reports of more advances by the Russians. All the territory that Ukraine regained over the course of the summer is apparently being steadily lost. There is apparently another big crisis for the Ukrainian troops further north in the Kupiansk area, where the Russians have played a long game. They've let again the Ukrainians send reinforcements there, which it seems is increasing the rates of attrition. Even in Kherson region, where the Ukrainians were apparently making, or they'd at least established that bridgehead in Krinky on the Dnieper River, it seems they're now suffering increasingly heavy losses. Things are not going well for them there. They're not able to break through. There are reports that Ukrainian soldiers are now refusing to fight. There's been 2 videos, one by a military unit in Avdiivka, one by a military unit in Kupiansk, saying that they are exhausted, that they are demoralized, that they're starting to question their orders. These are actual soldiers that are starting to do this. And on top of everything else, there's been this systematic demolition of Ukraine's air force. Something happened over the course of October and early November. There was a sudden change in the technological balance and dozens of Ukrainian fighter jets were shot out of the skies for no Russian losses at all. So the Russians are establishing aerial dominance. So one gets the impression of the front lines crumbling, coming under enormous pressure, and with a developing crisis in Avdiivka, which the Ukrainians can't reverse. And the Ukrainians, by their own admission, are now short of men, they're short of machines, they're short of tanks and guns. The EU's promises of supplying ammunition have not been fulfilled, which is unsurprising. There is, as you correctly said at the start of the programme, a political battle underway in the United States about whether to go on funding this bottomless pit, which is the war in Ukraine, and that might be coming to an end also. I get the sense that Republican opposition is actually growing to the idea of further funding for Ukraine, and Zelensky's apparently trying to make desperate calls to Donald Trump, of all people, to try to get him to persuade the Republicans to shift their ground on this. Apparently he's not responding. And, one gets the sense overall, a military situation, which we're not yet talking about a breakdown, and it's not, it's not happened yet, but it's becoming more fragile. And that is what is feeding into this crisis in Kiev, because with the military situation starting to break down, there's clearly a game of recriminations going on between the Ukrainian military and the Ukrainian political leadership, between Zelensky and Zaluzhny, as to who's to blame for this whole mess. And at the same time, there's clearly no agreement at all about how to go forward.
Yeah, but the European Union, they're saying that they're going to give more money to Ukraine. Germany actually said they're going to double the amount of military aid to Ukraine from 4 billion to 8 billion. Borrell said yesterday that yes, they haven't been able to meet the ammunition needs of Ukraine, but he's confident that they'll be able to ramp up production and get the ammunition to Ukraine that it needs. Where's the disconnect? Because the European Union is making it seem like they're in it for the long haul. I mean, even Scholz gave an interview the other day, and he said that we're behind Ukraine 100%, and we're gonna expand our support to Ukraine. I mean, Germany is taking a position where they're going all in for this conflict instead of perhaps scaling it back and maybe opening up negotiations with Russia. Germany's really going in hard with
Indeed, so
Ukraine now.
Indeed, so it is, and of course the EU Commission is now, as we know, preparing accession talks in order to include, to bring Ukraine into the European Union. I mean, at the moment, I have to say,
and more talks, and I'm going to cut you off real quick because more talks about Ukraine joining NATO.
NATO,
exactly. Throw that out there
all that, from Rasmussen as well. I mean, it all looks increasingly delusional and increasingly surreal. But it's not surprising. It's the kind of thing that tends to happen when a crisis starts to come together like this. And people who are already politically deeply inadequate and who've committed their entire political futures and their entire political careers and who have done enormous, probably irreparable damage to their own countries, start to see that the whole situation is, falling apart around them. Their instinct in that kind of crisis is not to rethink what they've done, because if they start doing that, then they open themselves up to criticism. It is to double down, and that's exactly what they're doing. So they're saying, all is well in Ukraine, situation is proceeding from strength to strength. Well, maybe this offensive that we got the Ukrainians to launch in the summer, maybe it didn't turn out quite as well as we hoped. But, we remain confident overall that everything eventually will come right. And all we need to do is to give them more money still, more weapons. You know, Ukraine's energy system is in a terrible shape, so we must give more money to sort out the energy system. Nobody explains what happened to all that money Ukraine got last year to sort out the energy system after the winter. I mean, nobody, of course, asks these sort of questions about, you know, maybe it ended up, instead of sorting out the energy system, in bank accounts in the Cayman Islands. Those are not questions you get to get from these, you know, these people, or no, and certainly no answers you're going to get from these people. So, you know, that is what happens. That is what happens when a project like this starts to fall apart. And again, you see the difference, and I have to say this, in levels of agency between the United States and Europe. In the United States, at all times, there was more skepticism about Project Ukraine. There were many more critics. There was more debate about it. There were votes. People were voted against things like this, you know, support for Ukraine in Congress. There was much more discussion in the media. And now that it's all falling apart, that means that there is an actual debate, even if it is a very strange debate, but there is an actual debate going on about this in the United States. In Europe, where they no longer have political agency, where talking about matters of this kind is simply impossible, where everybody rushed enthusiastically to impose sanctions that have been utterly devastating to the European economy. Debate is not allowed, and therefore, since debate is not allowed, the machine continues as before. It continues to do the same as it has been doing over the last year. The reality is the EU has had a year and a half to sort out its support for Ukraine. They haven't been able to do it in a year and a half. They're not going to do it now.
Okay, so there was a document that was published the other day, a report by ex-NATO and UN officials. And they talk about the possibility in the first months of the special military operation to have had a ceasefire and eventually a resolution to the crisis in Ukraine. And that document came to the conclusion that not only did the United States and the UK, Boris Johnson's infamous trip out to Kiev, not only were they behind the sabotage of a peace in Ukraine. We're talking about like the first couple of weeks. There could have been a peace. It was hammered out. It was agreed on. We had the frameworks to open up negotiations. Not only was the US and the UK behind the sabotaging this effort, but also Germany. And I think Germany has gotten off easy up until today with regards to derailing what could have been an end to this horrible conflict. Obviously, Boris Johnson has taken the brunt of the blame, given that he was the person that traveled to Kiev and delivered the ultimatum, the terms to Zelensky, and of course the U.S. Everyone understands that when you're talking about the UK, you have the U.S. behind Boris Johnson in the UK as well. But Germany played a very big role in making sure that there was going to be no ceasefire, armistice, or peace agreement in the first couple of weeks of this conflict, which has since led to hundreds of thousands of casualties and the destruction of Ukraine. We see it playing out. Ukraine is being destroyed. There's a lot of fault that should be directed at Germany as well. Olaf Scholz.
Absolutely. And can I just say something? You're absolutely correct. This is an incredibly important report. I gather it's received a certain amount of attention in Germany itself. Of course, if you're talking about the media here in Britain, they've not even mentioned it. But it is, to anybody who wants to understand why we are where we are and what the cause of the war was and who wanted the war, then in my opinion, this report is essential reading. And the people who put it together are very, very serious people indeed. One is Michael Schulenburg, who is a diplomat, a very senior German diplomat, former deputy UN Secretary General. He's held all kinds of positions. He's a person with an extraordinary record behind him, and from a family, by the way, a very famous diplomatic family. And the other was another one was Harald Kujat, who was a German general, and he was, of course, Germany's senior general, and he was for a time, I believe, the senior general within NATO itself. So we're talking about, very experienced people, and they've looked at all of this. And what they've come up, what they've produced, what they've provided us with, is some absolutely fascinating and really extremely disturbing information. So you're absolutely right. There were negotiations going on in February and March. We covered them at the time. And those negotiations, somewhat to our surprise at the time and later, actually were very successful. The Ukrainians and the Russians found a lot of common ground. Basically, they both agreed that NATO membership for Ukraine was impossible. And all the other pieces, once that point had been reached, all the other pieces fell into place. And it turns out that there were lots of people mediating and helping along with the process. There was the Prime Minister of Israel at that time, Naftali Bennett. There was President Lukashenko of Belarus. There was President Erdogan of Turkey. There was Roman Abramovich, the businessman. And there was also the former German Chancellor, Gerhard Schröder. They were all involved. And they all came very close to an agreement, and the heads of agreement were initialed in Istanbul between the delegations on the 29th of March. Now, what happened was that in the very first weeks of the war, right after the war began, the Germans, the French, the Americans, and the British appeared to support negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. And then, to their horror, they realized that those negotiations were going to result in an end to the war and a peaceful outcome to the crisis. So what then happened was that they brought together, they rushed together, they called together a meeting, a NATO summit meeting on the 24th of March. This is 5 days before the heads of agreement were initialed. Biden, who doesn't travel very much, flew in all the way from the United States. He met with all of these people, with Scholz, Macron, Johnson, Draghi, and they all then said, this is unacceptable. We don't like this at all. They started to impose unacceptable conditions for Ukraine to move forward with the peace. And then, of course, as we know, Johnson, who clearly was appointed the person to convey the bad news, first he telephoned Zelensky, and then he travelled to Kiev, and he made sure that the entire peace agreement was demolished. And this timeline that we've now been provided also, by the way, confirms something else, which of course we've always known, but those events, those alleged atrocities in that northern suburb of Kiev had nothing to do with the collapse of the negotiations. The decision to sabotage the negotiations was made before that happened. Now, that opens the question of why did all of these countries, the United States, Britain, Germany, as you rightly say as well, the Germans were also horrified that the negotiations were about to succeed. Macron and Draghi going along with the crowd. Why did they all decide at that last moment, that they would sabotage talks, that they would prevent peace being agreed? Well, I think the straightforward answer, the answer is very simple, and it's actually there in some of the things that people were saying at the time. Biden said in a speech in Warsaw, Johnson said when he visited Kiev, which is that they wanted regime change. They wanted to use the war to engineer regime change in Moscow. That was why the war happened in the first place. That is why they wanted the war prolonged. They still thought at this time, in fact, they were sure at this time, we're talking about March 2022, that the sanctions would have their effect, the military pressure on the Russians would also have its effect. They all believed that all they needed to do was to keep the pressure on the Russians a little longer, and they were going to get their regime change. So they did not want a peace that would deprive them of that war and of their regime change operation in Moscow. This document makes it absolutely clear, to my mind, who wanted peace and who wanted war. The West wanted the war at that time. Certainly the Russians and the Ukrainians also wanted peace. It was the West that was driving this crisis all along, and which has brought us to the situation in which we're in today.
The document also blows apart the stupidity of that narrative of the siege of Kiev as well, which Milley and Kirby and all of these guys pushed out, that Ukraine fought bravely in the opening days of Russia's invasion to drive the Russians out of Kiev. And the document clearly states that Putin removed his forces from Kiev and the surrounding areas as a goodwill gesture in order to get closer to initialing these documents and getting to a peace within the first 3 to 4 weeks of the special military operation. The document also makes it clear that that even Zelensky preferred a peace. I mean,
absolutely.
You know, if Putin's plan was to shock, let's say, shock Ukraine into agreeing to drop their whole NATO play, getting into NATO, it worked because Zelensky dropped the idea of getting into NATO, and
absolutely,
he came around to seeing things the way Putin wanted Zelensky to see things, which is no NATO, no military. There would be countries that would guarantee Ukraine's security, including Russia. And they wouldn't even be allowed to have militaries training or having exercises in Ukraine unless they got the permission of the countries that were guaranteeing the security of Ukraine. So, I mean, you know, Putin's gamble actually worked.
Yes.
If not for Germany, the United States, UK, and as you said, France and Macron and Draghi just going along as they always do. They go any which way the wind blows. But the real, you know, the real warmongers in all of this, the United States, the UK, and Germany. I wonder. I want your comments on what I just said, and then I want you to also answer one more question, which is legally.
Yeah.
Does this document have any legal weight for Russia or for the UN Security Council or anything like that?
Yes, well, let's discuss this because you made some very important points. Can I just add to that list of warmongers that you're talking about, Jens Stoltenberg and the NATO bureaucracy, who were clearly playing an important role as well. And you can see that also in this particular document. You're absolutely right. Now, what happened was, let's deal firstly with the siege of Kiev and all that, and the great Ukrainian military victory in Kiev. You're absolutely correct. We can reconstruct this a little. Now, I'm getting a little beyond what this document itself says, but I understand that over the course of the negotiations, the Ukrainians asked the Russians to pull their troops back from Kiev. Then what happened was that Zelensky started to come under severe pressure from the Western powers, from the Americans, the British and the Germans, and of course NATO, to drop this peace process. He initially resisted. and he gave a press conference, an interview to Russian journalists on the 27th of March, in which he again confirmed that Ukraine would not be joining NATO and that the peace was going to, proceed. This is despite the fact that at this point the Western powers had already made it clear that they were opposed to these peace discussions. So on the following day, 28th of March, after Zelensky gave this press conference, Putin took the decision to pull the troops back from Kiev as a goodwill gesture. And on the 29th of March, the document was signed. The draft agreement was signed. So you're absolutely correct. This explodes the myths of the great Ukrainian military victory around Kiev. It was a goodwill gesture by the Russians, requested by the Ukrainians, agreed to by Putin, when it looked for a time as if Zelensky was going to resist the pressure the Western powers put him under to pull out of this deal that was by this point emerging. What then happened is, of course, Boris Johnson, who acted as the enforcer, phoned Zelensky and then came to Kiev and, said that the war must go on and this peace agreement mustn't proceed, and basically made sure that peace didn't happen. And of course, we also had the big media campaign around the events in that northern suburb, which, by the way, as I'm sure you've noticed, no one ever talks about anymore. So all of that happened basically in order to sabotage peace. And you're absolutely correct that the whole myth of the Ukrainian victory around Kiev, which has been, such a foundational story in perpetuating the war ever since then, is just that. It's been exposed now as a complete and total myth right from the first moment. Now, this is a terrible document. It shows, to my mind, it confirms that an agreement had been reached before the war began, well before the war began, by the Western powers. They wanted their war. They were creating the crisis. They manufactured the crisis that would lead to the war. They wanted a war so that they could impose their massive sanctions against the Russians. It's clear that Scholz and the German government, the Habeck and Baerbock, were fully into the game. If you remember, Scholz and Baerbock, and by the way, Macron visited Moscow in the days leading up to the war. It's now absolutely clear to me that they were trying to pull the wool over the Russians' eyes about what was going to happen. And they were saying things that they didn't believe. And, they engineered their war in order to get regime change in Moscow. That was the neocon project all along. And they were not going to be deprived of it. And an essential part of that neocon project was Ukrainian entry into NATO. Because bear in mind, what this also demonstrates is, as you absolutely rightly say, the Russians and the Ukrainians were able to come to agreements. Zelensky was prepared to come to agreement. He was prepared to drop the idea of NATO membership for Ukraine. And clearly, that was unacceptable to the Western powers. So, which clearly means that at that time, they emphatically did intend eventually to bring Ukraine into NATO. So when Macron and especially Scholz were going to Moscow and said that Ukraine's entry into NATO is not on the agenda, they were lying. They were lying to the Russians, lying to their face. So this is where we are today. Scholz's role... Legally, let's talk about this. Now, if...
Go ahead, Scholz's role? You were saying Scholz's role?
Scholz's role in all of this was absolutely crucial. And I think it does beg a lot of questions about how German politics evolved in the months before the the start of the war, because clearly at some point he participated fully in the neocon regime change project in Moscow. He became a full accessory to it, a full conspirator, if you like, behind it, along obviously with Baerbock and Habeck. And this must have happened long before the war started. So again, all of his supposed objections to all of these sanctions that we were hearing about before the war started, that he was supposedly against, closing down Nord Stream. He was supposedly resisting Russia's disconnection from SWIFT. All of that clearly, or so it seems to me, must have been a lie. And he was obviously deceiving people in Germany, just as he was trying to deceive the Russians. So he's played an extraordinary double game. And going back to the point you were making earlier in the programme about why is he doubling down now? Why is he increasing the amount of money that he wants to send to Germany and to Ukraine and ramping up weapons and things of this kind? It's because, of course, he doesn't want his own personal role in this crisis to be properly examined and exposed. And this is where we come to the legal issue. Because, of course, if ever there is a proper investigation, if there's probably a full inquiry in Germany about this, about the origins of the war, which conceivably there might be. I mean, Germany has suffered massive economic damage. We had a meeting with a member of the an interview with a member of the AfD, Glenn Deason and I, Maximilian Krah, on the Duran, in which he discusses the economic damage that Germany has suffered as a result of all of this. If there is a proper investigation, there's a proper inquiry, then of course this report immediately becomes both evidence in itself, because the timeline is there, Scholz's statements are all there, and of course it also opens up further lines of inquiry as to the precise role he has played. And now I'm not going to go further. I'm not going to start talking about, potential prosecutions, because I'm, not able to discuss that because I don't have all of the knowledge. But it does seem to me that, there is at least some reason based on this document to think that one might come, prosecutions might come. I mean, he said a lot of things that weren't true. He prolonged a war that was against Germany's interests and Europe's interests, and catastrophically against Ukraine's interests. He seems to have been an instigator of that war, at least to a certain degree, perhaps to a great degree. And, I would have thought that at the very least, based on what this report says, he has questions to answer. Now, that, of course, relates to Scholz. It relates even more to Boris Johnson, to his Foreign Minister Liz Truss, to the Defense Secretary Ben Wallace, potentially to the Americans, to others too. But, of course, I don't seriously expect that any investigations like that will ever be launched. The most that might happen in Britain is that you might get a House of Commons inquiry someday in the far future, which will tell us about the mistakes and errors that were made over the course of this, and will gently rap some people over their, on their wrists and say, we didn't do very right. This is what happened after the Iraq war with Blair. It's what happened after the Libyan war with Cameron. That's all I suspect that we will ever conceivably see happen to Johnson and Truss and the others.
Let's not also forget the EU's role in this. We know as a fact that Ursula was in D.C. A month or two before the SMO started. Actually, 3 months before the SMO started, around November 2021, November, December, and she was actually holding meetings with the Biden White House, and they were talking about possible sanctions that they would place on Russia in the event that a conflict were to start in Ukraine. So they were laying out the sanctions roadmap 3 months before the SMO even started. So obviously the EU, Ursula, was in on this as well. And two more things to wrap up the video. What if Olaf Scholz and the Greens knew that something was going to happen to the Nord Stream pipeline?
Well,
what if they were okay with it? Sometimes in green ideology, the ends justify the means. What if they were aware that something could happen to the Nord Stream pipelines, because the pressure that they were receiving from the business community must have been uncomfortable for them. So that's just a thought. Yeah. Just a thought there. And the final thought, and we'll wrap up the video for you to comment on, is Ukraine, if it exists as a state in the future, and Zelensky, or maybe people in and around Zelensky who managed to survive this catastrophe, what they should do is they should bring a legal case against Germany, the UK, and the United States, at a very minimum against Germany and perhaps France. I don't know, just a thought.
Well, absolutely, and that is not impossible. It might conceivably one day happen. So, let's not discount that. But let's just deal with Nord Stream, because this is an interesting thing. Because you're absolutely right. If Scholz, Habeck, and the others, and of course Habeck is Germany's economics minister, so he's particularly close. He's to the business community, or supposed to be. He's supposed to be listening a lot to what these people are saying. Whether he does, of course, is another matter. But anyway, if these people had some foreknowledge of what happened, which we don't, it must be said now, no, but if they did, then of course they are potentially accessories, and as potential accessories, I suspect that in that case, they would be subject to sanctions under German law. To legal sanctions under German law. I don't want to go into too much of a discussion about this at the moment, because, we just don't have enough evidence to really speculate further. But, if they had foreknowledge of what was going to happen and let it happen, and weren't perhaps sorry that it did happen, then, as I said, there would certainly be legal consequences. Potentially in Germany itself. This is putting aside, wider international legal implications, which would also exist, by the way. Now, I'm not going to say more about that, apart from one thing, which is that, we see the situation in Ukraine starting to implode. And surprise, surprise, we now have all of these very interesting accounts about how it was all organised by, was it the six guys and the boats, all operated, administered, managed by this Ukrainian colonel who is now conveniently in prison. I'm not going to say any more. I think you did a very good video about this on your channel, so I'm not really going to cover that in more detail. I would just urge people to go to Alex's channel now and look up that video and see how he takes that, the humorous way in which he takes that all apart. But the question is, why is that story coming up now? Well, it could be because there's attempts to implicate Zelensky in this affair. But of course, it might also be because some people are beginning to get worried that with Project Ukraine falling apart, more questions about what happened with Nord Stream 2 might start to be asked by more and more people. So they want to get their alternative version out there first. So that's all I'm going to say about this. I mean, legal implications do exist in this, and you're absolutely right. Ukraine might have claims. Russia potentially might have claims, though again, this would be a shocking idea, I suspect, for many people. But perhaps more meaningfully, people in Germany potentially could have claims, business people, those kind of people. And last but not least, what you said about the EU and about the role of Ursula von der Leyen in this affair is absolutely right. I mean, she was also fully involved. She's in it up to her ears.
Yeah. Anyway, I mean, I just find it so interesting that you had this huge incident with Nord Stream. Scholz was standing right next to Biden when Biden said that they'll take care of Nord Stream if they need to. Obviously, there's coordination. Given this report, there was a lot of coordination in the early days of this conflict and before the conflict between the United States, Germany, the European Union, the UK, France. Obviously, they were coordinating a whole bunch of things.
Yeah. Well, coordination is a very, very, shall we say, mild word to describe what was going on. If it was coordination that led to legally actionable acts, then of course that coordination might start to look more like a conspiracy. But let us not go there. Let us not go there yet, because as I said, it's important not to get ahead of ourselves. The point is, this report in itself is absolutely crucial. It shows how a chance for peace in March last year was thrown away. As you absolutely rightly said in your previous comments, it also showed how Putin's calculations, what Putin's actual calculations at the start were, that he was trying to shock the Ukrainians into agreeing a peace and to demolish their idea that, this is peace for them could be found through Europe. It shows that he did have Ukrainian interlocutors, that the Ukrainians themselves understood that at the time. And we saw that the Western powers, having got their war, having started their sanctions, having decided on regime change in Moscow, were not going to give peace a chance. They were going to see that war continue, and they were intending to escalate it. And they still had hopes at that time that they would achieve regime change. All of that, I think, is now factually established. It is there in this report. The report also contains statements by Western officials, especially, by the way, Boris Johnson, which tells us, which shows clearly what he was thinking and what the others were thinking. And it is a critically important document. And one would like to believe, and one hopes, that when this crisis in Ukraine is over and people there start to ask questions about why the lives of their loved ones were sacrificed in the way that they were, that they would go to this report and other reports like it and start asking the right questions of the right people and start to take it further. And I think that if they did, we would probably find some very revealing answers, which we need to know also in the West.
All right, we will leave it there. TheDuran.locals.com. We are on Rumble, ODYSEE, BitChute, Rockfin, Telegram, and Twitter X. And go to the Duran shop. 20% off. Use the code TheDuran20. Take care.